So welcome everyone for today's quantum space-time seminar. Today we are very happy to have Netta Engelhardt from MIT, and she's going to tell us about Pythons in unexpected places. Thank you, Netta.
All right, thank you for the invitation. It's great to see all of the familiar faces. Hope to see all of you, at least some of you, in person at some point in the not too distant future. And yeah, so thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to be talking about the recent developments on the role of computational complexity in the ADS-CFT dictionary in the context of the evaporating black holes. And that might not sound anything like the title of this talk, Finding Pythons in Unexpected Places, but that's actually not my fault. That's the fault of the people who worked on this before me and decided to call the geometric avatar of computational complexity Pythons. So this, we just kind of have to roll with that one. This is based on work with Geoff Penington and Arvin Shahbazi-Moghaddam. This is 2 papers that we wrote a few months ago. And depending on how things go, I may or may not say a few words about some current ongoing work. Okay, so I'll begin with this sort of overview that I feel like we are kind of obligated to give nowadays, which is just a very brief overview of the recent developments on, and recent-ish at this point, developments on the black hole information problem. So here I've drawn the usual evaporating asymptotically flat, in this case, black hole, and the sort of paradigm that we are very familiar with from back in the mid-70s. And of course, in the past couple of years, we really have made a lot of progress on the front of the information paradox. This was precipitated by calculations of the page curve and has really taken off in many different directions. And this is one of the things that's, of course, most exciting is that insights from these developments are starting to teach us more about gravity in general, bring up questions that is gravity doing on ensemble averaging, what's the gravitational path integral doing? And these are all very, very interesting questions that have the potential to teach us more about quantum gravity, which of course is why we're interested in the black hole information paradox in the first place. Sure, it's a paradox, we want to resolve it, but also, of course, it has the potential to yield tremendous insights into quantum gravity. Now, a lot of talks and some talks that I've given are sort of pushing in this direction of what kind of mileage can we get on quantum gravity from the recent developments on the information, the black hole information front. And this talk is going to be a little bit different. This is sort of taking the perspective of it's not a time to celebrate yet because we haven't resolved the information paradox yet. And in this talk, I'm going to focus more on one potential way towards working towards an understanding of essentially what was missing in Hawking's calculation and was present in the more recent computations of the page curve. So this is that's the basic philosophy behind this talk. Now, this is a one-slide summary. Yeah, question.
Sorry, Netta, not to interrupt you so early. Please forgive me. But just since you began so nicely, if I can ask, and only answer if you want to, what in your view would constitute actually resolving the paradox?
Yeah, so in my opinion, an actual resolution of the black hole information paradox would be an understanding of how to correct Hawking's calculation without violating effective field theory at the horizon. And get a unitary evolution, exactly unitary evolution. That would be what I would call a resolution to the information paradox. We've certainly, we've made a lot of progress, but I don't think we're there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's briefly one slide recap of where we stand now. So in 2019, we computed the unitary page curve from the quantum extremal surface formula, which I'll just quickly remind you, that's the formula that takes the area of a quantum extremal surface over 4 plus the entropy outside of it. So if this is a region R, whose entropy we want to compute in the boundary theory, then the quantum extremal surface formula instructs us to find the surface chi R that extremizes the sum of these two, the generalized entropy, and compute its generalized entropy, its area over 4 plus the entropy of quantum fields in between the surface and R. And this is required to be homologous to R so that this out region is always well defined. And of course, if we have multiple such quantum extremal surfaces, multiple stationary points of the generalized entropy, which will be very important in this talk, then we take the minimal one. We take the one that has the smallest generalized entropy. And this formula can give you a unitary page curve. Now, in simple setups, so JT plus matter in the stationary case, or if we have an end of the world brane with flavors, like in the West Coast model, then if applying the quantum extremal surface formula to the radiation, the so-called quantum extremal island formula has been derived from the gravitational path integral, from the Euclidean path integral, and there have since also been generalizations by Schwinger-Keldysh to start looking at the Lorentzian path integral. So this is a very rough summary of some of the developments that are important for this talk. Now, I want to take a look at these two different calculations, the Hawking's calculation and the quantum extremal surface calculation. Now, Hawking's calculation can be done without any input from quantum gravity. That's kind of the point. It's a semiclassical effective field theory calculation, and it gives us evidence of information loss. Now, the distinction with the quantum extremal surface, or one distinction with the quantum extremal surface formula, is that while the quantum extremal surface calculation can be executed using tools from semiclassical gravity, areas, entropies of quantum fields propagating on a curved spacetime, the interpretation of it as a calculation of a von Neumann entropy, of a fine-grained entropy, actually requires input from quantum gravity, either via the ADS-CFT correspondence or via the gravitational path integral. So the one thing which is important here is that reconstruction of the interior of the black hole from the radiation requires input. Even if it's indirect input, it still requires some input from quantum gravity, which is something that Hawking's calculation, of course, did not have. And in working towards a resolution for the information paradox, addressing the earlier question, we do need to understand what input Hawking's calculation, sort of the fully semiclassical gravity answer, would need in order to obtain the quantum extremal surface formula. In other words, how do we correct Hawking's calculation to get an answer which is unitary? What is missing from it? And this is, now we have two calculations. We have one that actually gets the right answer, and we'd like to understand how to modify Hawking's calculation to obtain the quantum extremal surface formula, the quantum extremal surface answer.
So Netta, yeah. Just to, can I put it this way? But you can say, so Hawking actually calculated the state of the outgoing radiation, and he showed it was thermal, and then you can compute its entropy, and of course it's also thermal. Are you saying, well, what we would like to do is actually compute the corrections to the outgoing radiation state?
At the end of the day, yeah.
At the end of the day. And that, you know, maybe in some calculation which also has approximate locality, as you said, at the horizon, and then compute the von Neumann entropy from that state and show that it agrees with the QAS calculation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I ask another question?
Sure.
So. You know, the QES calculation, so I'm trying to compare that with the Likovich, Maldacena, Faulkner, I think, the one loop calculation. So there, of course, the correction was computed by taking the same Ryu-Takayama surface, and that was changed. But you say that, well, you know, in your prescription that is kept dynamically, and the sum of these two terms is itself extremized by choosing the. So in this way, do you actually go beyond the first subleading? I mean, is it like So
it's to all orders. That prescription is to all orders, and the arguments in favor of it are also to all orders.
I see.
Yeah.
It's something looking like one loop, but it actually encompasses Wow.
So it doesn't agree with the one loop calculation of Lefkowitz-Mulder. Okay, it agrees with the one loop calculation in the sense that it gives the same answer, but already at the first loop order, the surface moves. It's different. The quantum extremal surface is different from the classical extremal surface, the Ryuta-Yanagi surface. So the Faulkner-Lefkowitz-Mulder, which is the one loop calculation, that uses the classical Ryuta-Yanagi surface. And our prescription to it, which is to all orders, uses the quantum extremal surface. And part of what's critical for the success of the page curve calculation is that these two surfaces do not agree.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, oh, yeah, great. Okay, so we want to understand the difference between the actually semiclassical answer from Hawking's calculation and the operationally semiclassical answer that we get from the quantum extremal surface formula, but has quantum gravity input in it. So let's ask the question. Okay, let's ask the question, where was Hawking's mistake in the language of quantum extremal surfaces? We have these two ways of computing the entropy of Hawking radiation. The quantum extremal surface formula, equivalently the gravitational path integral, or we can do Hawking's calculation, Bogoliubov transformations, etc. And they give different answers. So we have to ask ourselves, where do these two approaches diverge from one another? What's the difference between them? Of course, they're in two different languages, so we're going to have to work with one or the other and try to bridge the gap. Now, if you'd asked me before 2019, where Hawking went wrong in this calculation, my answer would probably have gone something along the lines of, Harlow-Hayden argued that decoding the Hawking radiation, assuming unitarity, so that decoding is possible, is an exponentially difficult task, exponentially complex. And this probably means that somewhere, somehow, Hawking's calculation lost track of any exponentially complex data in the state. Because if you need access to exponential complexity in order to decode the radiation, well, if you don't have the access to it, then the radiation looks like it's just not decodable. And well, information appears to be lost. So that's one perspective that I probably would have taken in 2019 if you'd asked me this question. And again, the logic here follows from work initially by Harlow and Hayden, but followed up and elucidated further by Aronson and most recently by Kim, Tang, and Preskel. Decoding the post-page time Hawking radiation is exponentially complex in the entropy of the black hole. So potentially, Hawking's calculation could be coarse graining over the outcomes of high complexity operations. This is one possibility. It's very consistent with what we know about decoding the Hawking radiation. All right, what about post-2019? If you ask most people now, they would say something along the lines of, isn't it obvious? Hawking used the wrong saddle in the gravitational path integral. Now, the wrong saddle, what they mean by that is that it corresponds to a non-minimal quantum extremal surface, the one that corresponds to where the classical Ryuta-Yanagi surface was, the disconnected topology in the gravitational path integral. Now, there's a caveat here, which is that, of course, if you look at Hawking's calculation, he didn't, just say at some point, and now I declare that I will forever ignore high complexity physics. And he also didn't at any point use the gravitational path integral. But of course, we're trying to bridge the gap between two calculations here. So if we can reformulate Hawking's calculation in terms of the QES formula and understand what's missing, that would be very helpful in understanding the difference between the two. Right. So this is just a caveat here that, of course, we're trying to understand what's going on here. Hawking didn't actually use quantum extremal surfaces, and exponential complexity didn't enter his calculations.
I mean, sorry, Netta, of course you have said this, but just to put it so I understand, I mean, in other words, when you say wrong saddle, Hawking didn't try to compute the von Neumann entropy in the first place, right?
I completely agree. Yeah. This is why there's this little caveat here, which is he didn't do any of this. Right. But we're trying to to write Hawking's calculation in the language of quantum extremal surfaces, so we can start to piece apart the differences.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so we have these two different perspectives on what's missing from Hawking's calculation, what went wrong. Either complexity coarse graining or using the wrong saddle in the gravitational path integral. And we'd like to understand, how are these two compatible? These are two very valid ways of thinking about what's wrong or what's missing from Hawking's calculation. And we would like to understand if they're compatible, if this is really one and the same mistake. So what does it mean in terms of the Lorentzian bulk geometry to implement ignorance of high complexity data? How do we geometrize that in the language of quantum extremal surfaces? And also to use the wrong saddle in the gravitational path integral. Of course, the second one, we already know what it is. It's just the non-minimal quantum extremal surface. We have a Lorentzian bulk interpretation of that, geometric interpretation of that. But what about ignorance of high complexity data? Can that be somehow packaged into using the wrong saddle in the gravitational path integral? That would give us a unified understanding of where Hawking went wrong, and then we can start to compare the differences between the calculations and make progress on that front. So can we package these into one unified statement? Yeah.
Sorry, Netta, when you say we know what is the Lorentzian interpretation of B, do you just mean that, you know, if you didn't allow for the islands and you just took the state of radiation as Hawking would have calculated it and traced over the stuff inside in a Lorentzian picture, you would have got Hawking's answer?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So the wrong saddle is basically the saddle that gives you the Hawking answer, the disconnected topology in the gravitational path integral. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So this talk has only 3 sections, but each one is long. So the
question.
Yeah.
Sorry, just what do you mean by the disconnected topology? Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I don't see what is the disconnect. I mean, what has disconnected topology?
Yeah, so when you do the Lefkowitz-Moldesena, basically when you do a computation of the von Neumann entropy of the radiation using the gravitational path integral, then you introduce n copies of the system, and you basically do a gravitational path integral, computing trace rho to the n, and then you plug it into the formula of the logarithm 1 over 1 minus n, and take the limit as n goes to 1. And the disconnected topology, meaning the situation where the gravitational path integral, the saddle that fills in these different copies it gives you n disconnected copies. But the connected topology is the replica wormholes, where the dominant, where the saddle that you choose instead, dominant one, is the one that actually connects these. And then, of course, as you take the limit as n goes to 1, that gives you a different answer than if you have the disconnected set of geometries. Okay, so I'm going to begin by drawing the connection between complexity and non-minimal saddles, and we'll end up with a proposal, so-called strong Python's lunch proposal, that will allow us to unify this statement about complexity and non-minimal saddles in the gravitational path integral. And then I'm going to give a proof of this in the classical regime. And then I didn't put the word proof here because it's very hard to use something very rigorous like a proof once you start adding quantum corrections, but it'll be a strong argument in favor of it in the semiclassical regime. Okay, so the question is, where does exponential complexity live? How do we geometrize exponential complexity in ADS CFT, right? We want to put it in the same geometric language as the QES prescription. So this is where the very, very beautiful conjecture by Adam Brown, Ron Garibian, Lenny Susskind, and Geoff Penington comes in. It's called the so-called Python's lunch because apparently this looks a bit like a Python's lunch, although personally I don't really see it, but I'm obligated to use this. So what these folks proposed is that whenever you have a non-minimal quantum extremal surface in your entanglement wedge, then reconstruction behind that non-minimal quantum extremal surface is exponentially complicated. So here we have a Cauchy slice of the space-time, something that maybe starts out here and sort of goes through here. X min is the minimal quantum extremal surface, which means that everything to the right of X min can be reconstructed by reconstruction of the entanglement wedge from the right boundary. Here we have another non-minimal quantum extremal surface. This is this X over here. This here is the bifurcation surface, C. And this bulge between the two, the so-called Python's lunch, has a maximum over here, which we call the bulge, this gamma bulge. And the proposal is that if you want to reconstruct some operator here in the lunch region, then it's exponentially complex. And this, the complexity of this reconstruction is proportional to this exponential here, which is the difference between the generalized entropy, the area over 4 plus the entropy of the maximum surface here, minus the generalized entropy of this surface here, which we call the appetizer to the lunch. So in other words, this surface only comes in reconstructibility. It doesn't actually enter into the formula for the complexity. Now I put V here. This is the volume. This is weighted by some factor. It could be the action. It could be the volume. Sort of agnostic on which one of those two it is. Sorry, so this is, yeah.
Sorry, the word complexity appearing multiple times. So could you say a few words about how, what do you mean by that? I mean, unless it's too distracting.
Yeah. So here, what we mean is, if you want to do bulk reconstruction here, then what is the size in some sense of the quantum circuit that you would have to basically the number of gates you'd have to go through in order to be able to reconstruct this. So I'm gonna have a tensor network on the next slide, which will hopefully help with that, which basically tells you what is the complexity of this quantum circuit, this tensor network that you need in order to do this reconstruction. So we call it reconstruction complexity for that reason.
And just so, I mean, this is I think quite clear from the way you've said it, but just so I understand, the idea being that Hawking's calculation corresponds, as you said, to the non-minimal extremal surface. Yeah. Then there is, of course, the real minimal surface, which lies at the tip of the island, and the difference between the two, they're trying to quantify in terms of this bulge of the...
Exactly, and the difference between the two, the difference between the two, is exponentially complex. So then that suggests, okay, well, if you don't have access to exponential complexity, might be the same as having access only to things up to the non-minimal quantum extremal surface. So this proposal alone isn't quite enough to get you there, but we will get there.
Sorry, Netta. Is there a difference in complexity in reconstructing things up to C? And between C and X?
Oh, that's such an excellent question, but I'm going to have to ask you to hold on to it for just a few minutes, and I will get to that. Yeah. Thank you.
Just one more question, Netta.
Yeah.
How is this complexity different from, say, the circuit complexity which appeared in, say, Susskind's conjectures from before, or is it the same?
I would say it's the same. Lenny likes to say it's the restricted complexity. If you restrict yourself to only having access to the radiation, how complex would it be to reconstruct the black hole interior, as opposed to the unrestricted complexity, which you have access to the radiation and the lower dimensional CFT, and then you want to do reconstruction of the whole thing. I honestly think that it's mincing words a little bit, but I feel obligated to present both perspectives on this. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so here's the promised tensor network picture. So these folks who proposed at the Python's lunch were motivated by this tensor network picture of the bulk to boundary map. So here we have a tensor network that's a toy model of, these are not any particular tensors, they're not random tensors or anything like that. This is just a very rough sketch of what it might look like. So here we have a tensor network where we start out here. This is the minimal cut across the tensor network. And we push through the tensor network to get to the boundary. This is how we would do bulk reconstruction here. Now, this is the minimal surface, but this here is a local minimum. It's not a global minimum. Here we only cut 2 legs. Here we cut 3 legs, but this is a local minimum. And in order to be able to have bulk reconstruction, what you need is for this entire tensor network from this all the way over here, it has to be an approximate isometry. But that doesn't mean that every individual tensor has to be an isometry. In particular, I'm sorry, just getting a bit technical, so for people who are going to find tensor networks helpful for understanding this, I will just say that you can see that these tensors here, moving from left to right, are not isometries. This one, and this one, these in fact implement post-selection, and this constriction in the lunch, the fact that these are not isometry, they implement post-selection, you have to do Grover search. This is what causes the exponential complexity to appear. All right, so let me now.
Just to say that for non-experts, that was way too fast. Like me, that was way too fast. But I hope you'll explain a little bit of the sort of core ideas behind these tensor networks.
Yeah, so I will get a little bit more into this shortly. But let me just say, so in order to evolve to push through the network from here all the way to the boundary, we have to have this whole thing be an approximate isometry, which effectively means that the number of legs that we start out with here is smaller than the number of legs that you end up with over here. Basically, so you can embed one in the other. Okay. Now, it doesn't, now here we have, this is true here, but we also, this is not true every step of the way. So we have these tensors here where you start out, you have these two legs and they go to one. And essentially what that means is that if you want to go from here to here, you have to essentially search for the right state. And basically the most efficient way that we know of doing this is Grover search, which basically just kind of looks for the right state, and it takes an exponential number of it's effectively equivalent to an exponential number of legs implementing Grover search here to find this post-selected state. And so that explains this constriction here, which is the appetizer surface. And of course, we can keep on pushing through because we know that this is minimal, but this is a very expensive operation. And I should mention these dots here, these represent the bulk legs, which represent the degrees of freedom of the quantum fields in the bulk. So this is these in-plane legs are the geometry. These dots here, the outgoing, they're meant to be for the degrees of freedom of the bulk quantum fields. So this is the rough picture. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a little bit.
Can you explain a bit more what the exact relationship is with the quantum fields?
So this is a tensor network that's meant to represent both classical and quantum degrees of freedom. So basically, this will take the dimension of the Hilbert space of the quantum fields in the bulk. Okay. So I think this is now I'm getting around to answering Shiraz's question. So reconstruction up to the horizon is easy, or in fact simple. We just propagate the data causally via HKLL. So if we have some operator we want to reconstruct here, we can just look at the support in this sideways Cauchy evolution, this sort of non-standard Cauchy problem, and we say, okay, let's just the equations of motion. That's causal evolution. And everything behind this surface here is going to be exponentially complex by the Python's lunch. But as Shiraz pointed out, there's this sort of in-between region here between X and C, which I haven't talked about yet. And if we want to identify the Hawking's mistake with X, and we also want to identify it with coarse graining over exponential complexity, then it has to be the case that the reconstruction of this region had better be simple if we want that to be consistent. So what about this in-between region? So I guess this is sort of iterating what I just said. You want to have a definitive connection between coarse graining over complexity and the non-minimal quantum extremal surface. We need more than the Python's lunch, which just tells us that it's exponentially complex behind the non-minimal quantum extremal surface. We need to know that it's actually possible to do a simple reconstruction of everything up to the appetizer, even behind the event horizon for some while. And again, this includes part of the black hole. In purely classical spacetimes, this could even include the entire black hole, for example, for stellar collapse. This doesn't remain true once you add quantum corrections, but if we work purely in the classical limit, then we would expect that we can simply reconstruct the entire black hole interior for stellar collapse.
Sorry, Netta. Sorry, it's maybe something that I don't understand. But so I thought the picture is that that there is this. I mean, there are these two saddles, and Hawking, you said, would pick the wrong saddle in the gravitational path integral. But the way you are presenting this picture, this minimal extremal surface and the non-minimal extremal surface, they live in the same geometry. So this is not about the saddle.
It is. It is. It's about. It is because they live in the same geometry. But if you wanted to justify using this one for the computation of the von Neumann entropy, then you would do a gravitational path integral to compute trace rho to the n.
Okay.
And take the limit as n goes to 1 and use the disconnected topology. If you wanted to justify this one, then you would do the gravitational path integral to compute trace rho to the n and take the limit as n goes to 1 using the connected topology.
I see. So the geometries, resulting geometries are the same still.
Yes, that's right.
That the extremal surface changes.
That's right. Yeah.
But it could have happened that the geometries themselves are different, right?
No, because these are you're computing the gravitational path integral with the same boundary conditions, but that's for that you're computing it in the replicated geometry, which is not physical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but
so this is almost the physical geometry.
Broken and more complicated things could happen, right?
In what, like what?
I mean, sometimes the replica symmetry might get broken and the geometry itself may change, right? Or I don't.
So the geometry. So this space-time geometry is not what it remains unchanged because we're doing a gravitational path integral to compute something within this space-time. So this space-time doesn't change. You could have multiple extremal surfaces that come from doing a particular gravitational. Let me put it this way: you can justify the quantum extremal surface prescription from the gravitational path integral, but that's still the quantum extremal surface prescription in a given fixed space-time.
I see, but I thought the geometry that is obviously there is the one in the replicated space. In order to get to this space, you would have to quotient it out, right? You would have
this space exists independently of the replica trick. This is the space that we start out with. So if you prefer, we can just forget about the gravitational path integral here and just talk about the non-minimal quantum extremal surface. Okay. It just comes from, I use the term saddle because some people prefer to think of these in terms of the gravitational path integral, but it's really not, it's sort of immaterial for this in the sense that we just want to unify the non-minimal QES with coarse graining over complexity.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how do we coarse grain over complexity, and what part of the space-time do we end up forgetting when we do that? So in 2017 and 2018, Aaron Wall and I proposed that whatever reconstruction procedure, such as the HKLL, you can use to obtain the data up to the causal horizon, so up to the bifurcation surface, you can use the same procedure to reconstruct all the way up to the outermost extremal surface. So, and I'll justify why that is true in a bit. But if this is true, if our proposal is correct, then this is a converse of the Python's lunch, because it tells you that, well, this reconstruction is simple. And if you can use this reconstruction to get all the way up to here, then this reconstruction up to the non-minimal quantum extremal surface is simple, which means that we can identify having access exclusively to simple reconstruction with having access exclusively to the non-minimal quantum extremal surface and everything outside of it. So if this is true, there's a converse of the Python's lunch, which is really what we need if we want to identify Hawking's mistake with simultaneously with non-minimal quantum extremal surface and with coarse graining over complexity. So what did Geoff and Arvin and I do? Well, what we did is we gave a physics level of rigor proof of my and Aaron's proposal. In the classical limit, we also gave an argument in the quantum, the semiclassical limit, which gives very strong evidence in favor of the strong Python's lunch, the converse, which is that non-minimal quantum extremal surfaces are the only source of exponential complexity. And this is really what we need in order to have this identification between non-minimal QES and coarse graining over complexity. It puts the two perspectives on what Hawking did wrong on the same footing. Ignorance of high complexity data is identical to ignorance of the true saddle or the correct quantum extremal surface to use.
But sorry, Netta, what do you mean are the only sources? Are you going to explain that? I mean, or do you mean if it turned out that there's only one, say, quantum extremal surface, so it's by definition the minimal one, then it's
reconstruction is simple.
Then reconstruction is simple. Okay.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So basically, anytime you have exponential complexity, there's something like there's a non-minimal quantum extremal surface that appears somewhere in your space-time, and there are some in the quantum case, and I'll get to that. There's some obvious counterexamples, but fortunately they're not actual counterexamples.
And you probably said this, but just so I understand, if there's more than one, it's the extreme quantum extremal surface that's closest to the event horizon, up till which it's easy to go, and after that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So the outermost one is the relevant one for this. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this unifies this coarse graining with non-dominant saddle. All right. So what are some of the implications of this strong conjecture? Well, it means that in any system with a gravitational dual, information recovery will be being exponentially hard, implies the existence of a non-trivial quantum extremal surface. Now I'm going to say something here, which I'll come back to later, which is that compact quantum extremal surfaces can only exist when there is a past and a future singularity. So that means that we have the bulk dual to spacetimes that have exponential complexity then always has a future and past catastrophes. And I'll talk more about this later, but I kind of want to highlight this point already now. And in general, this gives us a lot of control and an understanding in some sense of the universality of difficult tasks in the dual theory. So we sort of learn a lot about the geometrization of exponential complexity. It helps us both in the understanding quantum gravity and black hole information better, but also gives us insight into what is hard in the dual theory.
So, sorry, I mean, you'll come back to this, but then I'm confused. You mean if you have a black hole that forms from collapse?
Yeah, I will come back to this. This is one of those obvious counterexamples that I mentioned that are not actual counterexamples, but it's very subtle. So I'll definitely get to that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk. I'll outline the proof in the classical regime, and because I do want to spend more time on the quantum case, which has these obvious counterexamples. So I won't go through everything in this section in detail, but I'll go through the basic ideas. So what's the basic idea? This is purely in the classical case. So for now, we don't have to worry about the case that Sandeep just mentioned. So, okay, what's the intuition here? That reconstruction is simple up to the outermost extremal surface. Well, the intuition, and this is not yet, I haven't yet made it precise, but here's just intuition. We would say the only reason for the outermost extremal surface to not lie on the event horizon would be if some matter were to fall across the event horizon, right? We expect that for a stationary black hole, the quantum extremal, so the bifurcation surface is extremal. So the only reason for it to not be extremal is if there's some matter that falls across the event horizon that makes the black hole dynamical. Well, this matter is on the event horizon. So in principle, what we could do is we could do HKLL. We evolve up to the event horizon. Then we figure out what matter is falling across the event horizon. We evolve that back to the boundary. We turn off that matter. Then what that means is that the event horizon now moves inwards and becomes stationary. Then we do HKLL again. We evolve back towards the event horizon. And well, now it looks like we've evolved all the way to a stationary event horizon, and we can recover the quantum extreme, the outermost quantum extremal surface. I'll talk about this in a lot more detail in a moment. This is just a rough outline. So yeah, so we remove this matter, we prescribe new initial data, we can evolve it backwards to the boundary, all using HKLL, simple and causal. And this, again, this requires that HKLL works outside of event horizon. This is an assumption that I'm going to make, even though it's a non-standard Cauchy problem. And essentially what this means is that we can sort of iterate HKLL back and forth to keep on removing matter from the event horizon as we need, and eventually get the event horizon to be stationary. And we get a stationary future horizon, and we do this backwards in time, we get a stationary past horizon as well. So doing essentially the idea that doing this over and over again, you limit to the outermost extremal surface. And I'm going to show how this works in figures. So the easiest way to see how this works, even though it does work in higher dimension than more generally, is in GT gravity with a massless scalar. So everything is two-dimensional, very simple. So we say, okay, well, we have some massless scalar. The horizon is not stationary. And so the bifurcation surface is also not stationary. In JT gravity, what that means is that the derivative of the dilaton evaluated at the bifurcation surface is non-zero in any normal direction, in any direction. All directions are normal. So this is any normal vector n, and this is going to be non-zero. That's what we mean by this being non-stationary in JT gravity. Now, in JT plus a massless scalar, the only source of non-stationarity is going to be the scalar. The scalar causes focusing across the horizon. So here I've drawn a massless scalar propagating along the null lines, and we have some stuff that's coming out of the past horizon, some stuff that's falling across the future horizon. All right, well, we can remove the source of focusing from the future horizon by turning on absorbing boundary conditions for the right moving field. So when it gets to the boundary here, we turn on, we say, okay, we're going to put absorbing boundary conditions, essentially turn off this matter. And now there's nothing falling across this horizon. What that means is this horizon now moves inwards a little bit. The black hole shrinks because we basically turned off some matter that would have fallen into it. And we have a new bifurcation surface, C2. C1, by comparison, lives here now. So now we have a new deeper surface. This surface is stationary in this direction because we've removed everything falling across it, but it's not stationary in this direction because we still have focusing across the past horizon. All right, well, we can deal with that. Now we say we're going to evolve backwards in time, and we're going to impose the same boundary condition that we're going to remove the right movers. So we start out here, now we evolve backwards, we basically do the same procedure, and we remove the right movers. Removing the right movers is going to cause this past horizon to become stationary and move inwards. Same thing, just in time reverse. And now we end up with the surface C3 here, a new bifurcation surface, which is deeper in. This one now is stationary along the past horizon, since we've removed all sources of focusing. But by removing this deeper in, we've revealed new matter that initially was behind the horizon, but is now outside of the horizon. Okay, so now we have to repeat this. We have to once again turn off this one and push this one deeper in. So basically, every time we push the horizon deeper in, we might reveal new matter falling across it, like we did here, where we're removing this matter, push this one deeper in, revealing this one and causing focusing over here, so that this surface is stationary again in one direction, but not in the other. Now you can keep on iterating this procedure. Basically, you start out, so here the procedure in sum total, you start out with this surface where there's stuff falling across behind the horizon and also outside. You turn off this, you end up just with those, you turn off those, now you've revealed this one. Now, this is bounded by the outermost extremal surface. You cannot go deeper than that, because once you get to that one, then you're fully stationary and there's nothing left to remove. But the question is, does it actually reach the outermost extremal surface? If you do this, if you keep on iterating this procedure, do you reach the outermost extremal surface or do you stop somewhere else? And we can actually prove this. So I have some backup slides on this if you want to see in the Q&A, but you can actually prove that indeed, you actually can, you do end up reaching the outermost extremal surface using this iterative procedure. Okay.
Sorry, let me embarrass myself. I haven't understood when you remove this matter, you change the entire space-time.
That's right.
So what
well, not the entire space-time. Okay. You change the space-time that's causally separated from it. You don't change stuff that's deep in the interior.
So what is the connection? You've done some procedure and got some new space-time, and then you had your original space-time, which you actually wanted to find an encoding of. What is the connection between those two spacetimes?
Great, yeah. So what we say is, what we know is that we know exactly which operators we had to turn on and off in order to get from the old spacetime to the new spacetime. And so we say, okay, in the new spacetime, we can simply reconstruct everything up to the outermost extremal surface. And then we say, and then we can just turn on all those other operators that we know exactly which ones we picked. And those operators are all simple in the sense that they're causally propagating. So that tells us that the procedure is simple to reconstruct up to the outermost extremal surface, and then it's also simple to go from that to the original space-time. So the two spacetimes are related by an insertion of simple operators. And so that means that if one is simple, if reconstruction of one is simple, so is reconstruction of the other.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, somehow I understand. I don't know why my mind can't do the time reverse so easily, but I understood your absorbing boundary condition, because there the operator is simply the one that would in a sense be turned on to reflect your right mover back in, you know.
Yeah.
And I guess that when you do it in time reverse, there's something similar you do.
That's right. Yeah.
Turn on some operator.
Yeah, exactly. You have to turn on an operator instead of turning it off. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So in the interest of time, I won't go into too much into higher dimensions, just to say that it's harder because now we have to work with the Einstein equation and we have the constraint equations, and it's a lot harder, but it turns out that you can still prove that this iterative procedure works. You have to deal with not just matter falling across, but also shear. You have to deal with fields that don't propagate along light cones. So everything is harder, but it turns out the same basic procedure still works. So I will skip this because I want to talk about the, I'm happy to take questions on this at the end, but I'm going to skip this so that I can talk about the quantum corrections. I was apparently overly ambitious in my plan for this talk. Okay, so let's talk about the semi-classical regime where things get somewhat more interesting. So as I already mentioned a couple of times, and Sandeep asked, there are apparent counterexamples here. So earlier in the talk, I said that non-trivial or compact quantum extremal surfaces can only appear in spacetime that have a past and a future singularity. And so we take a garden variety black hole here, Eddington-Finkelstein coordinates, that's stable. It's not evaporating. There are no extra complications. This is a very simple type of black hole. I don't mean simple in the sense of reconstruction. There's no singularity in the past here. So naively, we might expect that the strong Python's lunge proposal would tell us that the bulk is all simple to reconstruct, that reconstruction should all be simple. But let's ask, is it true? Is any of the bulk actually exponentially hard to reconstruct? And yes, we do expect that some of the bulk is exponentially hard to reconstruct. So if we take a look at some late time radiation, again, it's not an evaporating black hole, but it still radiates, of course. So we look at some late time radiation, and we look at the right moving modes here. Well, we expect that reconstructing these interior right moving modes is exponentially hard, because if we try to evolve them backwards, that makes them trans-Planckian, and that we expect that reconstruction of that, I mean, there have been a lot of papers written on this, reconstruction of that should be exponentially complex. Right. So the strong Python's lunge proposal would tell us that we should see another outermost non-minimal quantum extremal surface in this space-time, except, as we didn't show, but I told you, if you have a compact quantum extremal surface, you have to have a past singularity. So clearly something here must be wrong. Well, okay, I wouldn't be telling you, I wouldn't be giving this talk if it were wrong. So obviously there's a resolution here. What's the resolution? Well, it's instructive actually to take a step back and talk a little bit about bulk reconstruction and take some lessons from there and then apply them in this case over here. It's going to look a little bit like a non sequitur at first, but this is actually moving towards the same goal. So let's consider some bulk field, bulk operator phi of x here. This is a standard ADS-CFT, no islands or anything fancy. And we're talking about, we have some quantum fields in our bulk spacetime. So we have some region R, this is quantum extremal surface, this is the entanglement wedge. Now, this local bulk operator phi of x, it's only really defined, its action is only really defined within a code subspace of states of quantum fields and some semi-classical bulk background. To be precise, most bulk states are going to have some large black hole here. So if we want to talk about this bulk operator that we turn on here, we need to be talking about a very special class of states where we have this fixed geometry, and there's some quantum fields propagating on it that don't backreact too much, that don't cause a black hole, the large black hole to form, where we can talk about this operator, that the action of this operator is only defined within some code subspace. And now within this code subspace, if we want to reconstruct phi of x, we have to make sure that it lies inside of the entanglement wedge, meaning that this surface gamma, the minimal quantum extremal surface, is deeper in than this phi of x here. But of course, depending on the state of the quantum fields in the bulk, where gamma lies can change, because gamma is not a classical extremal surface, it's a quantum extremal surface, which means it depends on the state of the bulk quantum fields. So let's be precise here. If we want to reconstruct phi of x, that means that the bulk state before we turn on the operator, let's call this bulk state rho bulk 1, and after we turn on this operator, which we call rho bulk 2, both have to be in our code subspace. In other words, if we happen to act with phi of x and that takes us out of the code subspace, then we have a problem. But suppose that we say, okay, we take a phi of x that maintains us, we're within the code subspace, it's some low energy operator, fine. But what if we have a quantum extremal, two quantum extremal surfaces here? There's one that extremizes this quantity before we turn this operator on, but another one that extremizes this quantity after we turn this operator on. So if two different quantum extremal surfaces before and after we turn on this operator. And it could get worse. What if the first surface, this one, contains this operator in this entanglement wedge, but once you actually act with it, well, the quantum extremal surface moves, so this operator actually doesn't live in the entanglement wedge anymore. So this is a problem that comes up because quantum extremal surfaces are state dependent. So here's an example. We have two quantum extremal surfaces, and we say, suppose that before we act with this operator, x lies within the entanglement wedge because gamma 2 dominates. But after we act with this operator, the quantum extremal surface jumps, and now it's gamma 1. And this operator no longer lives in the entanglement wedge, and we cannot reconstruct it. Well, this was something that was investigated by Hayden and Penington, who found that if you want to ensure that a given operator is reconstructible within your code subspace, then it has to lie in the entanglement wedge when the bulk state is maximally mixed. So basically, if you want to be sure that no matter which operator you turn on, you can always reconstruct it, you have to be sure that this operator lives in the entanglement wedge within the maximally mixed state in the code subspace. That is what guarantees for you that this operator is reconstructible before and after you turn it on.
Sorry, Netta, is that simply because for the maximally mixed case, gamma 2 would be as far, I mean, yeah. Even though
it's the shallowest extremal surface.
It's the shallowest of the,
yeah.
Okay.
That's right. That's right. So we can see this also in this caricature of the tensor network. So the condition that an operator that sits between here and here be reconstructible is, it's the minimality condition between basically is a requirement that this, it's a requirement that, it's a requirement that this surface, this cut, be smaller than this cut. Now, I should be careful here and make sure that it's clear that when I say a cut here, that means also cutting all of the bulk legs that are relevant. So in other words, between these two, we're also cutting all of these bulk legs. So the statement, and again, this is only if it's instructive for those who prefer to think in terms of tensor networks, is that to make sure that we can reconstruct an operator between gamma min and gamma appetizer, it's a statement that this generalized entropy in the maximally mixed state is larger than this generalized entropy in the maximally mixed state, which essentially just boils down to taking a sum over all of these bulk legs. That's what the maximally mixed state is, log the dimension of the Hilbert space. Yeah. Okay. So what we do, and the way that we sort of save the conjecture from all of these apparent counterexamples, is that there's a similar story that holds for complexity. So it's easy to see from this tensor network description. Basically, the constriction in the tensor network, this appetizer surface, because think of this as the cause of exponential complexity. But it also depends on the number of bulk lengths, right? This reconstructability, so the generalized entropy of the appetizer surface for reconstructability is evaluated in the maximally mixed state. And we essentially argue that so is complexity. So complexity of reconstruction has to be determined by the non-minimal quantum extremal surface in the maximally mixed state of the code subspace. This comes again from, if you want to be able to do reconstruction in between these two, then you have to evaluate this in the maximally mixed state in the first place. So it has to be the case that this appetizer surface, that when we evaluate the complexity in the exponential of the generalized entropy of the difference between the bulge and the appetizer surface, we have to look at the appetizer surface in the maximally mixed state for essentially the same reason that we have to do that when we do reconstruction. Okay, so how does this save us? Well, we consider a code subspace. So we look at some late time slice of this non-evaporating, stable radiating black hole. And we construct a code subspace here. We construct this potentially from states of the Hawking modes across the horizon. So then we have some fixed geometry, at least the geometry of the slice is more or less fixed up to perturbative corrections. And we have some, and we consider code subspace that basically comes from building up modes that are within some distance of the event horizon. And we ask, in the maximally mixed state of this code subspace, is there a non-minimal quantum extremal surface that essentially lives on the event horizon that would prevent these from being simply reconstructible? And the answer is, yes, there is. So the maximally mixed state in this code subspace, that's this one, and that's when these two are maximally mixed with a third system. And in that state, there is a lot less entanglement between these two partners. And the fact that we basically have broken entanglement between these two partners results in very large entropy gradients in the far past. And these large entropy gradients actually nucleate a new non-minimal quantum extremal surface on the event horizon. So this appetizer surface is a new one as a result of the fact that we're working in the maximally mixed state, where these two are maximally mixed with an auxiliary system. We get large entropy gradients, and for the same reason that we get a quantum extremal surface, a non-trivial quantum extremal surface in the evaporating black hole, we get a quantum extremal surface in this radiating stable black hole in the maximally mixed state. Now, how does this, yeah.
Sorry, Netta, don't you just get a terrible firewall if you break that entanglement?
So the important thing is that we're fixing the geometry on a late time Cauchy slice. And sure, we get a shock and we get a large entropy gradients in the past, but not so much that we lose control of the geometry in this late time slice over here. So the important thing for us is we define our code subspace in terms of the late time slice. And if some states in there have early time firewalls, well, then we just have some states with early time firewalls. But at the late time slice, the geometry is well defined. So the shock sort of is smoothed out by the time we get to late times. It kind of gets diffused.
I see. I was just worried your new your new quantum extremal surface might just be totally unreliable because it formed somewhere and you got firewalls.
So yeah, we were concerned about this too, but as it turns out, it actually this is related to why this quantum extremal surface is allowed. So the gradients get larger, and the geometry gets progressively more unreliable, and in the past there's a white hole singularity. But fortunately, the quantum extremal surface appears in a regime where we still have perturbative control. So we have just enough control to actually figure out that this one, there's an appetizer surface here, there's a bulge surface here, and that later we have a past singularity and potentially a horrible mess. But that's actually what allows us to have a non-trivial quantum extremal surface here. Because this non-trivial quantum extremal surface means it has to be a past singularity, and we do find one, and it is caused by this disentangling of modes, which results in this terrible catastrophe in the past.
I see.
So fortunately, all of the orders of the timescales involved work out so that we still have perturbative control where we need it, and then we lose it later where we expect to lose it.
Okay, thanks.
When you're talking about the exponential complexity, in what variables is the complexity encoded? What is the complexity of
reconstruction? So this tells us that it's exponentially hard to reconstruct these right moving interior modes. Okay, so
could you rephrase it in terms of bulk operators, phi x and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, so this is with sorry, can you say that one more time?
Could you formulate the complexity in terms of bulk operators like phi of x?
You mean if I were to turn on a bulk operator here, what would be the complexity of reconstructing it? Is that the question?
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, then it would be exponentially complex in the sense of in the difference between the generalized entropy of the appetizer and the generalized entropy of the bulge. If it's over here it would be simple. Okay, so this was an answer to Sandeep's question. Indeed, we have a white hole singularity here. This is what allows us to have this non-minimal quantum extremal surface. So the refined strong Python's launch proposal is that non-minimal quantum extremal surfaces in the maximally mixed state of the code subspace are the only source of exponential complexity in the ADS-CFT dictionary. So it's critical that we work in the maximally mixed state. Otherwise, we could run into obvious counterexamples. I'm going to skip the technical aside here. Okay, so big picture. We want to understand the emission in Hawking's calculation in the language of Hawking's calculation. At the end of the day, it's great to have it in terms of quantum extremal surfaces, but at the end of the day, we also want to have it in terms of effective field theory. And but one way, the only way that I know to start this is to start by understanding it in the quantum extremal surface picture. And again, one way of doing this is understanding how the omission of complex data, this pre-2019 perspective on what went wrong in Hawking's calculation, and the omission of relevant saddles, or the use of wrong quantum extremal surfaces agree. And the strong Python launch essentially is what gives us. So the Python's launch, the ordinary Python's launch proposal tells us that everything behind a non-minimal quantum extremal surface is highly complex. The strong Python's launch proposal is that non-minimal quantum extremal surfaces are also the only source of exponential complexity. And this is what allows us to put the two hypothetical potential mistakes in Hawking's calculation on one and the same footing. And we will give, but we do give strong evidence again, but I wouldn't quite go with the proof that this remains true under the inclusion of quantum corrections. And I guess I will say one more thing, which is that I think the next step in the game is trying to understand this, of course, trying to port this over in some way to a non-holographic calculation, to understanding Hawking's mistake. And I will stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Netta, for a wonderful talk. Let's all unmute and applaud. We have some time for questions. So if there are any, please go ahead.
Sorry, is your point of view that these exponentially complex corrections to Hawking radiation, for instance, are beyond the ability of gravity to calculate, that you need to go to some formalism that has more degrees of freedom than gravity? Or it's...
So let me see if I understand your question. So you're saying, do I think that it's possible for us to go through Hawking's calculation and say, here's where we would need to correct this for the co-complexity, or basically that the actual calculation is so different that we need some, we're gonna have to see basically, I don't know, maybe some stringy corrections in order, or work with some string theory in order to see that. Is that the question?
Yeah, so, sort of, maybe I can put a context. I mean, if we had ADS5, we throw some stuff in, the energy can thermalize, make sort of a quark-gluon plasma in the middle, and slowly radiate out. Now, you would imagine that to understand all the correlations of the outgoing radiation, you need to keep track of all the degrees of freedom of the quark-gluon plasma. There are n square of those, many more than you have access to by keeping keeping track of just the single trace operators, just the gravitons. So you might think that that was a calculation that is out of the scope of gravity entirely.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, I think that there are some things that are going to be out of the scope of effective field theory for sure, and certainly actually computing the out state exactly, I don't think that's something that we're going to be able to do in semiclassical gravity. However, the problem with the information paradox, of course, at the end of the day, is always about asking whether there are order 1 corrections at the event horizon, and if there aren't, then there has to be some kind of calculation that we can do in effective field theory that is going to be consistent with unitarity. It may not give us all the information, but at least it has to be consistent with unitarity. So whether we can actually get the exact out state, I don't think so, but I think that we should be able to get something that isn't in contradiction with having a pure out state, if we expect to have effective field theory to be valid at the event horizon. Now, of course, maybe effective field theory isn't valid at the event horizon, but recent calculations suggest that there exists effective field theory calculations that we can do that are consistent with unitarity. So I'm not super sympathetic to that perspective.
Okay, thank you.
Quick question, Netta. Do you think that there is perhaps some way to compute this sort of a restricted complexity on the boundary field theory side, and by some arguments perhaps show that what the conjecture that this is related to the difference between the two surfaces that you mentioned? I mean, do you see a way to perhaps, do you think that can perhaps be shown by an appropriate definition of complexity on the field theory side?
I think in certain cases, yes. At the very least, I would expect that we would know if we're okay. I don't know if we'd be able to have a proof, because complexity is hard to define, although there's been recent progress on this from the field theory side. However, I think that we certainly have a good understanding of, if we turn on some high complexity operator in Euclidean time, we would expect that the resulting state is high complexity. So we should be able to do some sanity checks in cases where we say, okay, we know that qualitatively the state has to have exponential complexity of reconstruction, and we can ask, is there a Python's lunch in this case? In certain cases, we may even be able to do it quantitatively, although I would expect that'd be more like maybe in 1 plus 1D gravity and 0 plus 1D I guess YK, we might be able to do that. But in general, I think qualitatively, at least, if we should be able to have some sanity checks. Although I don't know if anybody's actually working on that right now.
Thank you.
Hi, Netta. So thanks for a very, very nice talk, which I'll of course have to understand much more. But let me ask you, if you don't mind, just coming to this point you made when answering Shiraz about a smooth horizon and so on. Let me ask you, this is perhaps too vague, but still, suppose we take a state, we can do it in say 1 plus 1D or whatever you like, which is not quite thermal, but pseudo-random or whatever people who like to make it look locally thermal, but actually have the information in it would like it to be. Prescal, Kimtang, whatever, right? So locally it looks thermal, but it's not really.
Right.
Okay, we take that state back to the horizon or the evaporating horizon. Locally, the stress tensor will look kind of thermal, I imagine, or not. Will it correspond to a diverging stress tensor on the horizon?
No, I would not think so. In fact, it shouldn't, right? In the calculation at least we have examples where it doesn't.
Yeah. That's okay. I don't know what these examples are, but I was also guessing that locally it looks not so different from the Hawking state, and therefore should not lead to a diverging stress tensor. But I wanted to ask you. Yeah.
It's so whenever you can. So in these unitary page curve calculations, right? We had an evaporating black hole, and the radiation is exponentially hard to reconstruct. It looks pseudo-random. But of course, everything across the horizon was smooth.
No, I know, but so in those cases, if you just looked at the radiation, if you didn't do something fancy like find a quantum extremal surface, just to go back to the beginning of your talk, if you just said, I'm just going to look at the state of the radiation, then more or less you would do what Hawking does, and it would look
right. I mean, it's pseudo-random, right? It's going to look to us like it's indistinguishable from maximally mixed. Yeah.
Right.
Unless you have access to this very high complexity probes.
Right. But suppose I take the state by hand, I take it by hand to be not quite maximally mixed, but pseudo-random, locally maximally mixed. Yeah. But if you look, and then I bring the state back to the horizon. I would think the stress tensor still looks finite and non-diverging and so on.
So I would like to think so, but this is a problem of order one corrections at the horizon, right? Do these exponentially small deviations from the thermal state actually add up?
Right.
Or do they not? That's sort of sometimes the $1 million question.
Right. But I was just wondering, I'm sorry, but in 1 + 1D, let's assume we know the answer, because let's assume the information comes out and so on, and it's not maximally mixed, but pseudo-random. Can we back calculate and see whether there's any hope of a consistent calculation where the horizon can be kept somewhat smooth? Or is that...
Right. So I think certainly if we take a particular pseudo-random state and we do this, then we can end up with a situation where the event horizon is smooth. The problem is this true of typical states? And is it true of a typical pseudo-random state that you can do something like this? And of course, that's the firewall question. And the answer is, I don't know.
Yeah, I see. But should it be so hard? Sorry. I mean, 1 + 1D systems are easy. Can't we create a typical pseudo-random state by doing some unitary taken from some, set of typical Haar and some...
Yeah. You can do that. Interestingly, what ends up happening is that when you do that, well, okay, so first of all, we have to trust the evolution of the equations of motion, which is the question, are we allowed to trust that? But interestingly, when you do that, when you look at operating black hole, what you find is that this outermost quantum extremal surface that I mentioned before, which is non-minimal typically, if you consider a Hilbert space, a code subspace of typical, that becomes a minimal surface, and you can't reconstruct any of the black hole interior. So do we interpret that as some kind of an avatar of something going wrong at the event horizon? Honestly, I just don't know at this point.
Yeah, I see. Okay, thank you very much.
So random matrix theory is sort of arising as the UV completion of JT gravity in some recent papers, like say the recent paper of Turiachi and others. So do you have anything to say about how random matrix theory has any relationship with what you're saying?
So not in this context. A lot of the lessons that we draw, so in fact, I would say everything that we did in these two papers with Geoff and Arvin is in general number of dimensions. I mean, I gave the proof in JT just because it's simple, but we do everything in a general number of dimensions, including the quantum calculation of the extremal surface, or the quantum extremal surface. And I don't know what to think about random matrix theory in the context of higher dimensional gravity. So I'm not sure. I think it's very valuable for getting insights in JT, but it's not obvious to me what it can do for us in the context of these higher dimensional theories that seem to have this universal phenomenon.
Well, for say near extremal or say the Kerr black hole, if you go to the near extremal limit, it's AdS2 × S2, and that's sort of a...
Sure. I mean, you can work in that limit, but these are also special cases if you want to use random matrix theory. And this is a very general phenomenon. So maybe there is a way of getting some insights from it, but I'm not sure what those are.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Okay. If there are no further questions, let's thank Netta for a wonderful talk once again.
Thanks so much for doing this, Netta.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you, Netta.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.